Professor Watson. Thank you so much for joining to our interview today. Could you please introduce us a little bit about yourself?
Of course. Hi, my name's Alexandra Watson. I am a lecturer at Barnard College, a women's college in New York City, and I have been a lecturer there for 3 years now. Before that, I taught at Columbia. So I teach a first-year writing class, which is an essay writing, academic writing class for first years only, and that's kind of the same type of class I taught at Columbia as well. I also have some experience teaching high school students, mostly in college access programs. So I spent a few years teaching at an organization called the Leadership Enterprise for a Diverse America, which is for low-income, high-achieving students. And there I was teaching kind of college writing skills along with actually the college admissions essay. And I still do some of that volunteer work working with low-income students on college application essays, which are quite the process.
I see. I've read through your Barnard, I think, faculty page, and I saw that you have, you're an editor, chief editor, and a co-founder of a journal called Apogee. I've had a chance to read through the mission statement. And what do you think is the importance of the Apogee's mission contributing to activism and social reform in general?
That's such a great question, and one that I've been thinking a lot about lately, especially in the context of the protests around Black Lives Matter and the sort of resurgence of activism in that space. And it's a sort of philosophical question that I think I've grappled with throughout my whole career as an editor, especially of a publication that's really dedicated to highlighting what we call marginalized voices that have sort of been left out of the traditional canon of white Western discourse. So when I think about sort of the role of literature in activism, I really draw on the work of writers like Toni Morrison and James Baldwin and Alice Walker and June Jordan. So writers who are able to sort of craft a philosophy and a theory through often literature, also through other, also through essay writing and giving speeches and things like that. So those kind of more traditionally rhetorical modes of convincing or persuading. But in my mind, there's something very powerful about the role of poetry and fiction and creative essays in creating a sort of imagination of liberation. The activists who are really doing the daily work of working towards racial justice now draw on and quote and cite these writers that I'm talking about, right? So I think it can kind of feel like literature has an indirect role to play because it's not protesting in the streets, right? It's not calling your representative or something that's like more engaged in the political process, but there's a way in which I think literature gives us sort of a vocabulary and a theory and a philosophy around freedom that we also need. With Apogee, it's about sort of like creating space for narratives and thought and experience that are not frequently seen in literary magazine publishing. And literary magazine publishing is one kind of pathway to book publishing. And so it does play a role in the kinds of narratives that we end up having access to as readers. Mm-hmm. And more directly, I guess I would add too that our the organization of Apogee goes beyond the literary journal as well. So we do things like community writing workshops that are low cost or free, that invite writers. You know, we have the philosophy that we kind of borrow from this organization called the New York Writers Coalition, which is that everyone is a writer, right? Everyone who has access to writing and has literacy can be a writer, right? Can be a poet and should have access to that. So we do these craft workshops where people can come generate work and share as well. And I think that's been one of the most powerful ways that we've sort of intervened in this literary ecosphere that can be very elitist.
Mm-hmm. I totally get what you mean. Mm-hmm. And talking about community, in my knowledge, currently you are a faculty teaching at Barnard College, which is a woman college affiliated with Columbia. May I ask why Barnard?
I have a lot of reasons, some of which are more personal and some that are more philosophical, I guess. So I'll start with the more philosophical reasons. So I've always been interested in Barnard, even before I started attending Columbia as a grad student, which is when I came more closely in proximity with Barnard, particularly in its tradition of women writers. So Zora Neale Hurston, Edwidge Dandicott, Patricia Highsmith, and Tozake Shange, writers who I admire, and I kind of see creating this lineage of sort of progressive ideas in literature. And so I think that along with the activism of students appealed to me. And then some of the organizations on campus, one that really appealed to me is called the Barnard Center for Research on Women. And they just have a lot of really good programming. They did a big conference on like imagining police-free futures, basically, that was about like community public safety and kind of transformative justice. So those were the kinds of things I was paying a lot of attention to. And I would, because I was in grad school at Columbia, I would find myself always, you know, going to events that were happening nearby. And I went to a lot of events at Barnard. So there's something about the people that that Barnard was bringing also that kind of gave me a sense of the ethos. I saw Jamaica Kincaid, who's one of my favorite writers, speak at Barnard. They had this great series, Caribbean Women Writers on the Page. Caribbean Feminism's on the page, I should say. And so those were some of the things about the school's philosophy that appealed to me. And then personally, there was an aspect of having gone to Columbia, teaching at Columbia, and knowing the sort of neighborhood, being sort of rooted in Harlem, living in Harlem, the libraries, having access to sort of the larger umbrella of Columbia, to me was also part of the decision to apply and then kind of persist, actually. So if I may tell a quick story, because I think it relates to something that I would share as like kind of advice for younger women professionals, is that when I first applied for the teaching job, I actually didn't get an interview. And yeah, so I was teaching at Columbia. I was an adjunct, which means you're not full-time. You kind of have a number of classes a semester. I had just one class per semester. So I was cobbling together a whole bunch of part-time jobs. And I was like, oh, this job that could bring together all of my interests in one full-time place. So I was really, really passionate about Barnard. And so I actually responded when I learned that I wouldn't be getting an interview, and asked, not in a pushy way. I wasn't asking why I didn't
Right.
chosen, but I was asking what made the candidates who were successful, basically, or stand out. And first, I mean, the director of the program gave me really solid, concrete, great feedback. Things like publishing your articles or attending and speaking at conferences. These were practical things that I could do to kind of make myself stand out more in this pool of applicants. But then a few days after that email, she actually emailed me again saying that she'd gotten approval to hire an additional person and that would I like to come in for an interview.
That is so great.
Yeah, and she told me she kind of had this feeling about my cover letter. She felt like it was one that stayed in her mind, and that when I emailed to follow up, it just fell together for her. Yeah. So I thought that was, I mean, for me, that's something I try to keep in mind is like, if you really feel like something is a good fit for you, because there's other times when I haven't gotten the job and I'm like, okay, that maybe this is not a good fit, to just ask again. And even if that means, I mean, even if I had if what I had gotten out of that was just these concrete ways that I could improve my CV and my application, it still would have been worthwhile to ask.
What are some differences working in an all-female community that you have noticed?
That's another great question. And I have not that I've done any research on this or that I was conducting a study, but I do have an interesting kind of series of case studies to compare, because I teach a pretty similar class at Barnard that I taught at Columbia, and the Columbia class was co-ed. The Barnard class only Barnard students can take. And they're all for first years. So it's usually around the same age group too. So from my own observations, and I guess I'm drawing on my own experience as a college student as well, that in the women's college classroom, there seems to be a little bit more confidence to participate among the students, and that confidence doesn't feel gendered, right? Whereas in my Columbia classes, I noticed, I think it's not their fault, but the way that young men are socialized is kind of to speak up when they have an idea, to have confidence, to be strong in their opinions and arguments. And my class is all about crafting arguments through writing. So I think that there's a way that can stifle the women students who might be a little bit more self-conscious or might feel like they're already an imposter in a particular academic setting, right? Because I think that's an experience that Barnard students totally have too. Like they get in the classroom and they think, oh my gosh, everyone is so smart, and everyone feels like they're prepared for this college experience. So that imposter syndrome is not unique to Columbia or to co-ed environments, but I think it becomes more pronounced because, and this is just a theory,
yes,
I think that male students are more socialized to feel like they belong in an elite institution. And that they're kind of entitled to belong there. So I think it's creating a classroom community, to me, it's a little bit more collaborative in my experience, right? I'm sure there's people who would say otherwise, but I think that there's kind of an empowerment of collaborating among young women, and then it also generates a sort of an intersectional feminist approach to learning and to classroom spaces. That's my experience.
Then do you consider yourself as a feminist in that sense?
Yeah, yes, I do.
What does feminism mean to you then?
So for me, it's I think there's both theory and practice. I'm thinking recently more about practice, so sort of the activities that the organized activities on behalf of women's rights. That's kind of one way of defining feminism, and to me that is what I'm interested in right now. I think also it involves attending to sort of the social construct of gender and the way that social construct has real material effects on the way that we live. So yes, it's a social construct, but it doesn't mean that gender doesn't create real conditions. So those are the kinds of things that I try to be aware of as a feminist. Definitely, I think an intersectional perspective is essential to feminism. Kimberly Crenshaw is a professor at Columbia. I mean, her name has been definitely coming up a lot lately, but I like to make sure that I cite her when talking about intersectionality, because sometimes I hear the word being used to mean more of allyship, like if white women and Black women come together, for instance, that's intersectionality. That's how I've heard it used, that I actually think is not the right way. Because Kimberly Crenshaw defines it as sort of when interlocking systems of oppression come together to affect a person or a group. So the way in which her original article in which she coined the term was about the way that Black women working had neither the had neither the access to opportunities that men had, nor the protections that white women had. So both axes of their identities, race and gender, were both acting to oppress them. And so, of course, you can bring in other facets of identity as well. But I think what's key to the definition is that oppression. So I wouldn't consider a white, straight male an intersectional identity, even though it's attending to multiple facets of his identity, if that makes sense. So for me, that's really essential, because the more that I read about history and feminism, the more I understand the way that these things all come together. The idea of what it means to be a woman, the oppressive ideas of what it means to be a woman have also been shaped in the context of race. So what it means to be a white woman has been shaped in opposition to what it means to be a woman of color. So it's hard to kind of disentangle some of these ideas.
As an educator, what is your opinion on the purpose of education? I know you talked about that program you have in Apogee writing community, so like uplifting those voices that are marginalized in the general public, specifically in the contributing to global equality. What do you think is your opinion on the purpose of education?
Yeah, so there's the role of sort of writing-based or literacy-based education, which I think has to do with narrative, voice, representation. More broadly, though, I always think about, when I was in high school, I did Model United Nations, and I always went to the committee that was on women, like status of women, or I would do social, humanitarian, cultural, anything that had some attention to women's rights. And one of the things I remember really sticking with me is the way that the development of a country is largely tied to, the economic development of a country is largely tied to the women's education. So you can actually track when educational programs for girls are implemented, access to political participation goes up. So, voting, democracy, and the economic situation of a country improves. So I guess I always thought that the situation of women is a kind of marker for the progress of a society overall. And so I guess that's where my mind is going when you ask about global education, although it's kind of specific to the role of women and girls being educated, because women and girls are denied access to education more often. So I'm always trying to attend to those who have less access.
Do you think there is any drawback to the way that we're traditionally taught in school? I think for America, like a more democratic countries, is less obvious how there's a gap between education, but overall, do you think there's a drawback to traditional way of teaching?
Yeah, the reason why I hesitate is because I guess I can think of so many problems, and that are different at every level of education. I mean, just the issues around school returns right now is like it's kind of like illuminating a lot of these problems. But the biggest overarching problem to me is just that the fact that more money can get you access to a better education, and that I don't know how to separate capitalism from American education, especially with the cost of tuition, and not just tuition itself, but other kinds of programs that would get you access to or make you a favorable kind of candidate to admissions counselors. So I'm thinking about higher ed because that's where I work. But certainly the inequity exists at the level of primary schools, even thinking about public versus private, and things like that. So I think inequity, that's the biggest overarching problem. I know it's not super specific, but that's what I would say.
Thank you. I was really glad to have the chance to be in your classroom, and all the advice that you gave me in this interview and then in class were super useful. So I wonder if there was one feminist resource that you wish everyone would read or view. What would it be? A suggestion?
Yes. So I'm going to go back to Kimberly Crenshaw because she has a podcast called Intersectionality Matters, and she's doing a kind of special series on the pandemic right now and the way that COVID has kind of affected people differently depending on their conditions in society. But the main emphasis of the podcast is interviewing the mothers and family of women who've been killed by the police. And so she's kind of the one who also has been a big force in getting Say Her Name, the hashtag and the sort of movement behind it, off the ground. So really thinking about the ways that we tend to ignore or kind of gloss over the violence, the state violence committed against Black women. And of course, like, we're seeing real attention to that with the murder of Breonna Taylor right now. But she interviews a lot of family members of people who I'd never heard of before. And I feel like she's just brilliant. She really connects you to the theory of intersectionality through these experiences that people have and the ways that the state interacts with people depending on their identities. And so that to me has been really fruitful for my own development of my feminist thinking lately.
Of intersectionals.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all the resources and the advice that you gave. Before concluding our wonderful interview with a wonderful professor today, what are 3 pieces of advice that you think are important to give to the younger generation?
First one is going to go back to my anecdote that I shared with you before, which is ask twice or more, follow up. Because, like I said, it's not just about being pushy or defensive or trying to say that you're or imply that you're entitled to a particular opportunity, but knowing that there are other people who will follow up and who might get the opportunity just because they followed up. And if not, you haven't really lost anything because, you know, you've already been denied, so-called denied, right? I even tell, you know, people when I'm doing like an editing or revising workshop or something around publishing, I tell people to ask the editor if they get a rejection and they really wanted to be published somewhere, to try to ask why. Mm-hmm. You might not get a response, but if you do, then it could be really instructional for you. Yeah. So if not getting the second opportunity, then at least getting some insight into what you might do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one, ask twice. Another one that I've really been thinking about and that I shared with you in the Women Writers Institute is kind of ritual over routine. Thinking about the purpose of what you're doing before you think about the tasks at hand. So this is just an example that's coming to mind. One of the ways I've been thinking about this recently is that in teaching, the method of designing a course that has been sort of proven to be most effective for students is starting with the objectives, the learning objectives, and working backwards towards the content, the actual text you're going to use, the material. And it sounds kind of obvious when I say it, but I think the default way to do things is actually to start with the text we want to teach and then figure out, because we like text, we like working with material, right? And then to kind of figure out how those texts help get to that goal. And I think that's a good example because you can do a lot of work, like spinning your wheels, trying to connect the individual tasks that you're doing to a larger purpose. But if you start with the purpose, then you might sort of reorient which tasks actually need to be prioritized. So every day I do this when I wake up. When I start to work, I reflect first in writing. Like I'll jot down some ideas, because otherwise what I tend to do is just check my email, and I end up responding to email all day because I didn't set out my day with a purpose. I set out to complete tasks, like on a checklist, right? Which ends up feeling like, oh, I've expended so much energy today, but I haven't actually done anything. You know that feeling, right?
That feeling.
Yeah. So And I think that feels especially important right now because I honestly feel like we all should be doing less work right now because it's more taxing to do any kind of work in the situation that we're all in. And so really thinking about, like, you have a limited amount of energy and time. What do you really want to commit your energy and time to? Does that mean like you would rather get a B in your science class and start a new literary journal at your school than like maintain your perfect GPA? You know what I mean? Things that can feel like in the moment you're not getting the checklist down. But if you kind of reorient to think about purpose, I think that can, in the long run, be more helpful. And then the last one, I prepared my little bullet points here because I wanted to make sure I had advice. The last one is to build with your own cohort. I think a lot of times we think we need to figure out how to get in touch with the person who's sort of at the top of their game in our industry or our field, when in fact, like, the people who I'm most inspired by are the people who kind of created a community of others working on the same kinds of, projects. So actually looking at your peers as people who will one day be your professional network, rather than thinking, that person who's the CEO needs to be a part of my professional network. No, your friend will be the CEO in 20 or 30 or 40 years, right? So build with the people who you think are doing the kind of work you want to be doing, who are actually at your same level, because those will be the people who actually give you opportunities later on.
Right. Empathize with the mission that you are doing and the place that you're standing right now. Right.
Yeah, they kind of those kind of goals fit together in that way, because if you find other people who have a purpose that aligns with yours, then you're naturally going to start sort of working towards those things, sometimes without even realizing it. Like sometimes I'll have a really great conversation with a friend and I'll realize, we just came up with an idea for something, and it's just because we share some kind of value or mission. So I think it's empowering too, to know that the people around you are people you can collaborate and build with.
Yes.
Those are the things you're going to be really proud of.
Thank you so much for the interview today. I learned a lot, not just about feminism, about education, and just life in general.
I'm so glad to hear that. It's a pleasure talking with you. And if you ever want to do a follow-up, I'd be happy to.
Totally.